History fans, welcome back to the Spots of Love podcast. I am your host, Karan. Today we have a special guest here with us, cast and crew member from Barney and the Backyard Gang, Mr. Dwin Towell. How are you? Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
For sure. I always tell people, especially folks who worked on this show, how much of an honor it is to have you guys come on and share your stories and just trust us with the conversation. So I want to say thank you here on the episode again for allowing us to do this.
Happy to be here. A lot of fond memories.
Awesome. For us, I like to just start always from the very beginning. Before we talk about Barney a little bit, can you just explain and tell your story on how you got into the entertainment business to begin with?
Well, I was in high school and I joined an Explorer Scout group that was a specialty group at the local public television station. And we did a program proposal that got accepted. And I basically spent 2 years as a high school student learning TV production. Went to college at Austin College in Sherman, had an on-campus job at our television studios, met the local TV station manager who hired me on the spot one day after he saw what I was doing at the college, and the rest is history.
Wow.
So I've been doing this about 52 years.
Man, that's a remarkable time span, and I'm sure that you've seen many different things. Are you still in television in a sense today?
Yes, currently I work for the Dallas Cowboys as the director of broadcast engineering.
Nice. That's awesome. We'll talk about that a little bit later because I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. When you first got into the business, what's some of the things that you worked on, or what was like your very first job that you were able to do coming in?
Well, the first job was a musical program featuring high school students, and I came in working. Well, I trained under director Mark Smuckler, who used to direct a program called Newsroom.
Okay.
And Newsroom's host was Jim Lair of the Jim Lair Report on PBS. Of course, he was just local at that time, so that's where I got my initial training.
Nice. That's awesome. And then I believe you also went later on down the line to work on a children's program called Sunshine Factory, correct?
Yeah, in fact, I was just catching up on that show recently.
Yeah.
And that was a show I enjoyed. We had to be very creative. We had a low budget and do special effects on our own. And that was quite a show for its time.
Can you explain for people who's not familiar with what Sunshine Factory is, just what that show entailed or what it was about?
Well, it was a Christian-based show, and it was really enhancing moral for younger people, for children. And there was a lot of music in the show, a lot of singing and dancing. It was about PJ, who ran this Sunshine Factory, which was kind of a fix-it shop behind the scenes, and all the kids would gather there and basically have a good time doing good things.
That's awesome. I don't get into it much here on the podcast, but I have my own children's program that I do called Mr. K's Clubhouse, mainly inspired by Barney, but also some of the other shows I watched on PBS. And when I went in to start developing my show almost 5 years ago, I binged a whole bunch of different shows, very popular shows that maybe didn't make it so popular. And Sunshine Factory is one of those shows I came across that I watched a little bit to see, how did people tackle different things and just kind of make magic work with the resources they had available. So you, by having connection to both of those shows, you've been a part of my process of figuring out how to create my own kind of show in an unspoken way.
Oh, that's good to hear. I mean, those shows compared to what's on today, for the most part, those shows, the credo was keep it simple.
Yes.
The concepts were simple. The kids understood them. They were getting, enhanced teaching of what they're not really shown much of today in your typical Saturday afternoon or Saturday morning show.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm biased because I grew up in those times, but I think television, especially for children, was just better then, because they were simple, but they also covered more of a span, I think, of what was educational. Like, I think today when you think of a children's show being educational, it's only solely focused on like the social emotional things, which are great and are important to have, caring for yourself, caring for others. But it seems like anytime a show today is educational, it's just those topics, and they ignore all the other things that kids can learn from and grow from, which is
right. Educational today is largely STEM oriented, I've noticed.
Yes.
And it neglects that important part of your development.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Why did you get into, when it comes to like children's entertainment, was there something specific that drew you to it, or was it just a job that you took and then, realized you enjoyed it? Or why did you get into doing some children's based kind of things?
It kind of happened with Sunshine Factory. I started out as the technical director and moved into a directorial spot later on because I had a grasp on, at that time, a lot of things were shot film style, single camera. Mm-hmm. And I had a multi-camera background and kind of brought that to the forefront. And it was a much more economical and efficient way to produce things. So I kind of gravitated to that spot. And special effects were kind of, a fun hobby of mine, and I was able to use what we had, and I had enough electronic knowledge to use it and in different ways and stretch the budget a little further. And I've always enjoyed working with kids anyway. I've been I'm a scoutmaster currently, and I've been in scouting since I was 7 years old.
Oh, nice.
I'm almost 70 now, so what does that tell you?
Wow.
Yeah. But I enjoy it. I mean, the kids are usually receptive. They're easy to work with. They don't have huge egos. And you generally have an atmosphere of fun on the set.
Yeah. I think it reads on screen very well, especially with like shows like, Sunshine Factory or Barney, those kind of things. But the fun thing with kids is like they're just interested to do almost whatever, right? Whereas an adult, some things are like, oh, I don't really want to do this or that. But kids, they're just into just having the fun, and you can almost ask them to do anything, and it's a little easier to get them to want to do that and engage in it and actually make it look believable.
And most of them have pretty active imaginations anyway.
Exactly.
So they don't have to act per se. They can kind of really draw on themselves and have fun.
Absolutely. Let's transition to Barney just a little bit. You were a part of Barney and the Backyard Gang initially. What was your introduction to Barney? Like, how did you get on to the set of working on this children's show with the purple dinosaur?
Well, I worked for a company called Color Dynamics, which was owned by Richard Leach. And his daughter-in-law, Cheryl Leach, came up with the concept for Barney. Well, one day we had done a number of programs, educational, religious for the Catholic Church and that sort of thing. And one day he called me into his office and he said, Dwin, as soon as we finish some of our other projects, my daughter-in-law has an idea for a children's show. And I want you to look at it and see about crewing it and getting it set up. And I want to produce this show. And I thought, well, we were a little studio in Allen, Texas. And I thought, okay, we'll give it a shot. And got the crew together, and Barney took off. And that's really how it started. And Cheryl was a real genius with that show. She knew exactly her audience and exactly how to market it. And it went very well.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah, for sure. And I know I don't ask this question anymore because I always ask it, and everyone says the same thing. I know at that time, no one saw this show being as massive as it became. Was it difficult working on a show like Barney with this giant dinosaur and things? Was there anything different about working on that set that, or any challenges that were posed that didn't exist when working on previous things that you guys had done?
Well, to do this show, we tried to do the best we could do with the budget we had. And of course, we weren't located in Hollywood. or New York. So we didn't have access to everything, animated characters and costumers. And we had some very good people locally who liked the idea and really pitched in and worked hard on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you, when this show got started, when you were given like the idea of the show and you guys started working on it, did you, at that time, was it more of just like just another program, let's do this and put this out? Or did you kind of seeing it being somewhat successful, even just locally for what it was?
It was different than anything else we had worked on. Primarily what we had been working on at that particular studio was educational and religious based, primarily for the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Now, I had experience with the Sunshine Factory before and kind of used that as an audition because I really wanted to be a part of this show.
Sure.
It brought my imagination to bear also. I thought this could be actually fun to work on.
Yeah.
And that's why I really wanted to get involved with it.
Yeah. What was your, in the very early days for those, I think the first 3 videos, what was your role? Because I know later, like with the next set of videos you came on, you directed a couple of those. What did you do behind the scenes in those very first 3 videos?
Well, I was the technical director.
Okay,
We primarily in charge of interpreting the effects to our capabilities. We used chroma key and things like that, pretty basic.
Sure.
But we stretched those as far as we could. We had to get very creative.
Yeah.
For underwater scenes, we couldn't afford, expensive animators. So we actually shot the footage and we then took a fish tank, put water in it, rippled it, shot through it, did things like that to be creative and take the show a little further.
Wow. That's really interesting that you say that. Because I guess, back in like the 80s, there weren't just those kind of effects like they are today. Like when I did for one of my episodes, we went underwater. And today, you could just Google or search on one of those stock image places, some water flow kind of things, and just put it over.
Right.
Back then, you guys really had to create.
Everything was organic.
Yeah.
And also, television was all analog and not digital like it is today. So when you were editing and doing effects, you couldn't layer like you can now. Because every time you layered, you'd lose quality. I mean, that's part of the reason why the first Barney was kind of a blue color instead of purple.
Yeah.
That's a whole story within itself.
Right. Yeah, it's starting off blue, and then when you put him, depending on what background or green screen or whatever it was you put him on, he almost looked black in certain things just because.
Well, he started out as a Concord grape, purple. And of course, the television tubes of the time, as you went down generation after generation, it began to shift towards blue. In fact, we affectionately referred to him upon completion as the big blue dog.
Yeah.
That was a common term.
Yep.
And that's why in later versions, like the long-term home release versions, he became the color that you see today.
Right.
Which is a magenta.
Mm-hmm. And I understand you're kind of the reason behind that color being chosen, right?
I was the irritant, yeah.
Yeah.
Because talking to the producers, they didn't like the color shift. And I said, well, we need to, do some experimentation so you can actually see the color that he's going to become. So we took all of these color swatches and put them in front of a camera, and we ran them down a couple of generations, and they all started shifting towards the blue. And I finally said, look, Cheryl, all the colors you've chosen are really too close to a Concord grape. And I know that's what you want to see, but it's not what you're going to get. And so in frustration, finally, she said, well, what would you use?
Yeah.
And so I grabbed the swatch of a pure magenta and I put it in front of the camera, and we ran it down a couple of generations, and it held its color. Mm-hmm. So Barney is actually a pure magenta.
Yeah.
That's our purple dinosaur, and that held up. It's held up through the years. I think that's still last time it was produced, that was the primary color.
Yeah, yeah. And it was a great change it was great that you were around to have that, to be the irritants, like you say, for that, because it did so much better, like you said, on screen. What was it kind of, when you're not the person who created something, and you're talking to the creators and you're telling them, hey, the idea that you have is great, but it needs to change if you want this to work. Was there any kind of hesitance you had with speaking up and saying that, or were you just kind of used to going, hey, this is, if you want to make this work, this is what we have to look at and see?
Well, 50 some odd years in the business now, I'd say I'm a lot more diplomatic than I used to be.
Sure.
I used to be firmly rooted in the science of the business and had made enough mistakes to know what the end result was going to be. And it was kind of frustrating to see some of the things that you knew were going to turn out the way they were, turn out that way. So then you could say, now try it this way.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily, Cheryl and the group showed enough patience to go along with it, and embrace some of the ideas later on. Yeah.
That's awesome. But I love that. I love that story because I think it speaks true. Like we've always heard from many different people we talk to, or we've heard on other podcasts, people who worked with Barney. Everyone always has this sense of family, but sense of respect and protection of the character that I think even in those very early days, you, Cheryl, and all those guys clearly had then as well, because you wanted him to just look the best that he could be on screen,
right,
even if that meant we have to change things that we initially were set into. So I think it's cool that she, got to a point that she trusted you with that, and you were able to do that, and it worked so well. But it also just really compliments how much you guys cared about this character and wanting it to look, as great as you can with the resources you had at that time.
Well, it was very much a family type environment. There was almost a protective atmosphere over Barney.
Yeah.
For one thing, if you really want to get into it, we were at a company that was a part of a larger company. Mm-hmm. And everyone wanted their slice of the pie. And of course, people who weren't involved in the creative thing like television production,
sure,
kind of saw it as a boondoggle, if you will.
Uh-huh.
Like, why is our company wasting so much money on this project?
Yeah.
It couldn't possibly go anywhere, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And then it did go somewhere.
Yeah.
And it ended up being the top grossing portion of that company. And really, in many people's opinions, including the owners, it saved the rest of the company because it was so popular, and it proved the impossible.
Right.
That a little studio in Allen, Texas could create a children's show that went not only nationwide, but eventually worldwide.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't really realize the impact of the show until I was working on the Olympics in Athens, Greece, and happened to turn the TV on, and there was Barney, and he was dancing and singing in Greek.
Wow.
And I knew that, it had an impact.
Yeah. That's interesting. I was going to ask you that question because I like to hear at what point did people who worked on this show finally see how big Barney was? Because, when you're locked in that studio, you're just creating the work. You don't get to see. It's not like obviously now, with social media, you can pop open an app and see the popularity of something that you're creating almost in real time. Back then, you had to physically be somewhere in public, or you in a completely different country, and see it just on TV to know, like, hey, this is a thing that's really, really going further than we expected it to.
Well, even today, it's hard to really realize the impact that the show has had.
Yeah.
When I've gotten a couple of different calls from people writing books and doing podcasts, and it really surprised me. Mm-hmm. I thought, well, it's another show that will fade into obscurity, but it just keeps coming back, and that's exciting.
Oh,
and
yeah.
People will relate that the impact the show has had on them as a young child, and it makes me feel really good to have been a part of that.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like it's so interesting with Barney, more than Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers and all those shows were great and still hold true today after all these years. Barney was interesting because he was one of the shows that did so many things that other shows hadn't done, right? Reached so many people, but I feel like was one of the shows or characters who got the least amount of love and acceptance from public if they weren't fans of the show, right?
Well, that's interesting because, adults, I'm not going to say they hated the show, but they really weren't, they couldn't see it.
They didn't understand.
But that's where Cheryl Leach really was true to her vision. She had a vision for the show, and it was aimed at the younger child.
Yeah.
We always kept it simple so that the younger child would see it, enjoy it, not be confused by it.
For sure.
And that's the secret to the show. That's why a small child would sit in front of the show and watch it for hours and hours because they could understand it. Now, that's not to say that occasionally we didn't throw things in that an adult might appreciate. Like when I was directing, there's one overhead shot in, I think, Waiting for Santa, where the kids are on the way to the North Pole, and you suddenly see they're on a pond and they're ice skating, and then we do an overhead shot, and they're doing these movements. Yeah. And it's similar to a movie you'd see in the 1930s or 40s, because I wasn't born that long ago, but I used to watch those movies, and I see those shots, and I think, gee, that's cool. And so I adopted that, for one scene in that show, and that was for an adult, but it was fun for a kid too to watch.
For sure. Yeah, and I think she did a great thing with sticking to that. And even when in the later years, when they started to add other characters, they would sometimes throw in some bits or pieces that older kids or adults could appreciate and understand. But I think it's cool with Barney that he's like right now he's been off air for 15 years or so, but he's still as prominent and that is important and in part of every conversation, even without a continual TV running show or things like that. So I think that just speaks also to just how important the work was that you guys did, but how important that character is to so many generations. My daughter is 3 years old and she loves Barney. YouTube, when she looks at the YouTube logo, she thinks of only Barney or my show. And right now she's really obsessed with Backyard Gang. Like she watches the other things, but she's always, anytime she wants to watch it, she wants to watch the big one is what she calls them. And she just loves those first 6 videos. And so a kid that has never lived in a world where Barney was a thing on TV, just being shown through, my childhood love for the character. And she sticks to it just like I stuck to it in the 90s, just like kids, have done so many years in between. So it's a really amazing and remarkable thing to witness and see now as an adult looking back on my childhood and all the generations I've seen also gravitate to that show the way they have.
Well, I think what's really cool about the show is those kids, had fun in their own backyard. Yeah. There weren't any cell phones, no video games, no computers. Mm-hmm. They just had instruments you'd find in a garage or in a shed. Yeah. And you made believe and had a whole world to yourself.
For sure.
Kids who used to go out and spend all day building forts in the woods and things like that and having fun. You still can't beat that.
Yeah. No, those are the best times when you had to go, you had to figure out where the fun was. You created it for yourself. So it used a lot more creativity and imagination than picking up a cell phone today and playing a game, takes. So yeah, it was such a wonderful time in life back then. You mentioned that scene in Waiting for Santa where they're ice skating and there's that overhead shot. Can we talk about that shot for a second? Because how was that shot done? Was Barney literally there spinning and the kids were around him? Because like some people think that the kids were shot first and then Barney was input later. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case. How was how'd you pull that off to make that shot happen?
Well, everything, like I said, was organic, and what you see is what you get. So we did an overhead camera, and which in those days was not an easy thing to do. The cameras were quite bulky, and shot down and choreographed the kids doing their thing. Then Barney we put on a blue screen background and put Barney on his back and did the spin. And then we keyed it in over it to get the overall effect. Wow.
Interesting. That's really cool. How was it? Let's talk about those two movies where you, well, first, I want to back up. The first person that directed those first three videos was the late John Grable. And I believe you were responsible for also bringing him in and then him, I think, subsequently bringing in people that he knew to be a part of those first videos, right?
Yes. John I had known because I had worked on some Christian television shows with him. And I knew that he had the patience necessary to work with the children and to understand that this is the budget, this is what you have to work with.
Yeah.
And John brought a high degree of professionalism in with him, and having worked on other children's shows, he knew people like Jamie Connor who could come in and do the artwork and that sort of thing. And we really drew on what I think was the best in Dallas or the area. To do the lighting, to do the costumes, to help wrangle the kids, all the things necessary to do a show of that kind.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then moving on to doing the next three videos, you came into the directing role yourself for, I believe, Waiting for Santa and for Campfire Sing Along. Is that
That's correct?
How was that experience jumping in front of the screen, or jumping up to the role of directing and being able to direct a full video, the two full videos for Barney?
It was pretty exciting to me. If I had to pick a time in my career that was really the most pleasing, I would say that was it.
Yeah.
Because I was directing and I enjoyed directing creative entertainment type shows, and I was working with kids. It was kind of the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
And we had our own little world there. It was funny because my daytime job was managing that whole studio.
Oh, yeah.
Because we still had other clients and editorial going on and that sort of thing. So it was a stretch, but it was a stretch that I really enjoyed at that point in time.
Yeah. And you came in, for when you started directing, it was a different Barney than those first three videos. It was the sets were more expansive. The music was there was more songs, first of all, in them. So there was a lot more that you could play with and do with those scripts that the first three videos didn't necessarily have yet. When it comes to directing those, is there a favorite behind the scenes moment or something that you just enjoy the most out of all of that when working on those shows?
Well, first of all, let me say that it was exciting being able to work with the evolved Barney.
Yeah.
His color didn't only change, but his costume was a little bit more creative, easier to work with, moved a little bit more. And to be able to have a real choreographer, Miss Penny, did the choreography. She was really great. But remember that we still use that same studio, and it was only a 40 by 40 soundstage out in Allen, Texas at that time. And we still had to shoot out of sequence, because we'd only have room to set up so much at one time.
Yeah.
If the Santa's Workshop was being set up, there's a Santa's Workshop. And, even at that point, people may not realize it, but like in any other show, sometimes you throw Easter eggs in there. Like in the Santa's Workshop, there's a point where they go to this machine that has he been good or bad list on it. And if you look closely at that list, you'll see my name roll past, plus the name of my children.
Oh, cool.
Is on there too. So that'll always be there for them to see and look back on.
That's awesome. I love that. It's so cool how creative you all had to be, especially with that space. I was in Texas in March, and I went by Color Dynamics just to be kind of on the grounds that Barney once stood. And I saw where the studio portion used to sit, and I didn't get to go inside or any of that. But in comparison to the studios they moved to in the later years, you just have to be so creative with how you utilize every inch of that space. Like I, as a kid, and then even looking at it now, knowing that it's as small as it was, it still is remarkable to me because it seems like you had so much more space than what you actually had to work with. And I think that came down to how well you would direct it or how well the cameras would shoot everything to make it look bigger than what it was, especially when you put this huge dinosaur on the set as well. It has to look like it's big enough to even fit him. So it's always amazing to me how you all were able to pull that off in those early days.
It was a challenge. We tried with the artwork and the keys to maintain some sort of perspective and a foreground and a background to make it as believable as we could make it.
Yeah.
Of course, using your imagination gives you a little bit of leeway.
Absolutely. Out of all the Barney films and videos that you worked on, do you have a favorite one that you hold above the rest of them?
Probably Waiting for Santa.
Waiting for Santa.
Yeah.
That's like the classic for everybody.
Well, we all had a hand in it. From the living room set, it's funny, we were choosing the color schemes and things. In fact, I brought a show and tell from that particular show, if you're interested in seeing it.
Oh, yeah, please do. Please show it to us.
Well, it's not small. This is the mantle clock from Waiting for Santa.
Awesome.
And it's the one that in the opening scene, the camera pans across.
Yeah.
And you see it sitting up there. And the reason I have it, I didn't seal it from the show, but after the shooting, most of the props were rented. And this came from an antique store, and they gave us the opportunity to purchase whatever we wanted to. And that's a piece that kind of caught my attention. So I bought it at that time. And I never realized that the show would become a classic, and viewed by so many people. But that's my small portion of the show.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of, Santa Claus and the kids' anticipation and all of that, was fun to work with.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely one of the ones a lot of crew who worked on the show back then really enjoy. But even the fan community, like kids like us who grew up with the show, that is one of the ones that's always mentioned when we're talking about what's a favorite. And I think it is just like what you just mentioned. There's Barney there's Santa Claus, and the enjoyment of Christmas time and what that means. And I think it just, even as simple as the video was, what it was captured so well that it just holds up through all the generations. People really just love that video. Which is amazing. Does the clock, does it still work? Does it still tick for you?
It still ticks. It still chimes.
Awesome. Nice. Oh, it also has it chimes as well?
Yes.
Like on each hour?
Sometimes annoyingly so.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's a really cool piece to have for sure. How long, when was your separation from Barney? When did you leave the show and go off to do other things?
I think it was after the 3 home releases. I went to work for another post-production company.
Okay, yeah.
And I came back for a brief stint at Barney a few years later, purely from an engineering standpoint. A close friend of mine had been a video engineer, Bink, forever. And he was unable to do it. And he said, well, I trust you to do it for me while I'm gone for these few episodes. And so I stepped in, and it was good seeing how Barney had evolved. They had moved to different studios by then and bigger sets and much bigger production.
Yeah, for sure. I was going to ask you about those because it was a thing. I talked to Andrew Olson, which I know you're familiar with. And I asked him, had he known about you working on any of we call it the park era stuff, because when they moved Barney to the park set hit was in control, and he wasn't aware that you came back and did work behind the camera. So that was one of my questions to ask, because IMDb has you listed, and I was like, I wonder if this is true, because sometimes people just add credits to people's names, and so I wanted to ask if that was a true thing. So it's cool to hear that you were there.
Yeah, but it was more of a favor I was doing for a friend.
Yeah, for sure. But seeing, you said it was kind of cool seeing how Barney had evolved and the show had evolved. It was there were still some of the same, I think, core things that Barney always was, but the way that Hit did the show and like who Barney became was far different than anything beforehand. Was that what does a video engineer, for people who aren't aware, what do they like? What's their role behind the scenes?
Well, Barney was shot multi-camera, usually 3 cameras. And the video engineer makes sure that, number one, that famous color, purple or magenta here, is reproduced faithfully the same on all 3 cameras, so that when you cut from one camera to the next, everything matches.
Sure.
If it didn't, it would be jarring, or it'd be a big deal in post-production to make it match. But if you can start out with everything matching and looking believable, you're ahead of the game at that point.
Yeah. Awesome. So this is interesting to me because you were there through many different iterations of Barney. The very, very first version, you saw kind of where Hit took it, and now we have this animated version of Barney that is supposed to be coming this year. Do you have any thoughts on those different iterations, or any thoughts about this animated version that we're supposed to get? And anything?
Well, I haven't seen it, of course. I don't think anyone has, and I hope it holds true to the original concept of Barney, and that the small child will see it and understand it and enjoy it.
Yeah. Have you seen the art that they released of how he looks?
No, I have not.
Would you like to see it?
Sure.
I'll tell you now, it's completely different than what Barney's ever looked, which is interesting. But I'll pull it up here so I could show it to you. I want to know what you think of this. Let's see. Here we go. Here we are.
Oh my.
Yeah, much different.
Yeah, he is much different. I mean, the concept is the same. The features are much bigger, I guess.
Yeah.
Especially the eyes.
The eyebrows, yep. For sure.
It's nice to see both arms working, though.
Yeah, exactly. Not just one that's limp there, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting that was announced last year, and so we're supposed to get it in the fall this year, but we haven't seen anything about it. But there's a lot of mixed review from fans and also people who worked on the show about his look and the leap to animation, and what, of course, animation today is a little cheaper, I think, to produce than live action Barney shows are. So that part makes sense. But it's interesting when like new companies take over established shows or characters, and they always have to change something. So sure. It's interesting how drastic of a change is, at least with the eyes and the teeth being like the buck tooth and those kind of things. It's interesting that they made that decision.
I don't think that's going to really matter that much, as long as if they hold true to the concept of the show and to their audience, I think it'll be fine.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I had the opportunity of working on one of their road shows, and seeing Barney on a stage dancing and animating and interacting with the audience, and especially seeing a live audience's reaction.
Yeah. That
really told the tale of what Barney the dinosaur was. I mean, there was magic there. Yeah. And the kids were using their imagination. They were engrossed by it. And the shots of the kids were as good as the shots of the dinosaur at that point, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Was that, do you remember what tour that was that you worked on? Was that also like the later years? Like,
yes, I think it was maybe we taped it. That's why I was there as a video engineer. I think we shot it maybe in Arizona.
Okay. Yeah. I wonder if I think it might have been Colorful World, I think. Where they traveled to like different, the beach and like the Antarctic and all those different kind of places.
It could have been. I mean, it's been so long.
There's been so many, and so many things that you've done. Yeah, for sure. That's really awesome though. It's cool though too that you got to see, being someone who started, behind the screens and directing in those very early days, and then coming back and being able to see a live show and really see that impact in person. It's cool because a lot of people who worked on this show, not a lot of those folks were able to see Barney in one of those tours to really see the magnitude of how big he was. So it's cool that you got to see both sides of that, behind the scenes and what that looks like, but then also seeing this character with thousands of kids in an audience and what that relationship was like between the two. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun when you can observe the match.
Yeah, for sure.
That's all I can really say about that. Is to see it firsthand is very fulfilling.
Yeah. With any of those costumes, did you ever get a chance to like peek inside or put them on, I guess?
Of course, we all tried them on.
Yeah.
The Big Blue Dog era, that was a big experiment. And in fact, we had to keep everything clean because you would really sweat if you wore that for a long time. And we actually spritzed the inside with vodka.
Oh yeah,
as a disinfectant.
Mm-hmm.
And we got more sophisticated as time went on.
Yeah,
but that's how it was handled at first. But we all tried the costume on, put the arms on, put the shoes on. One day during the Barney Goes, what is it? We called it Barney Goes Camping. But I think they called it
Campfire Sing Along.
Campfire Sing Along, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I walked into my office and this oversized sleeping bag was on the floor, and Barney's feet, the crew had put Barney's feet sticking out the end of it. It was a surprise.
That's awesome. I love that you guys. I like that you guys had fun behind the scenes as well, because I think that also read well. Even if you weren't the folks on the screen, I think it read well through the kids and through Voss, who was in the costume at that time. That it was just a fun environment. So it's fun that you guys, to hear those kind of stories, that you guys you got to goof around a little bit and actually enjoy the work. Even though it's a job, finding the fun in the job is always cool.
Well, with that many kids on the set.
Yeah.
And with a big purple dinosaur, you're bound to have a good time.
For sure. For sure. I don't know if you'll know the answer to this question. I'm going to ask it because you were there directing that video. One question that we always wonder is, in Campfire Sing Along, there was a different kid that joined for just that one video. The kid who played Jeffrey, I think it was. His thing was he just wanted to eat. He was excited about food. Do you recall or remember why he was a one-off coming in and then not being seen again after that video?
Well, the kids had lives of their own, and in some cases they moved. In some cases, I don't remember his particular reasoning or why he wasn't there the next time around. But Barney was going through a transition at that point in time, becoming a bigger show. Yeah. And it could have been the schedule, his education, et cetera.
Oh, sure.
Anything. We never really said, hey, this kid's got to go. Yeah. As long as I was there, I never recall any incident like that. Mm-hmm. Usually if a kid was no longer there, it was because of something in his own family. They were moving, et cetera.
Sure. That makes sense. When it comes to directing and working with kids, obviously, as you understand, they're kids, and what I try to tell myself, because we cast local kids in our show as well, um, that they're kids first before there are actors or dancers or singers and those kind of things. But you still need to get the shots and be able to film this thing. What was it? How do you approach directing children and getting them to pull off the shots that you need to get to make whatever piece of work you're working on actually happen?
Well, we would first of all sit down at a table and read through the script.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would try to give them a mental image of what was going on so that they could really let their imaginations take off. Sure. And they could kind of live it before they sat down in the set or in front of a blue screen and did their thing.
Yeah.
And then once we were into the scene, Barney was usually there, mm-hmm. and he was kind of leading it. He was kind of the group leader, the scoutmaster, if you will. Mm-hmm. So by that point, they were really into it.
Yeah.
Aside from the crew being there and the cameras, they were into the scene. If they were camping, they were camping. If they were in Santa's workshop, they were in Santa's workshop.
Yeah. That's did you have, I know with Ricky Carter, who played Derek, his first video was Waiting for Santa. Yeah. Did you have, and then I mentioned the kid who played Jeffrey, that was just his one-off appearance in the whole franchise. Did you ever have, I don't want to use the word issue, but moments where the new kids coming onto the set needed a little bit more help getting into it? Like for me, when I work on my show, you can get them to be themselves, and then as soon as they notice there's a camera filming them, there's always one at least who kind of shuts off, and you gotta pull them back in, and to have them ignore cameras or whatever's happening and just get back into the fun of it. Was that ever an experience you guys had, maybe particularly with new kids joining the rest of the cast?
Getting them not to look at the camera, is the hard part
for sure.
And that's kind of the beauty of having multiple cameras. There's always a cutaway shot if you needed it.
Definitely.
But it wasn't unusual to have to remind them to ignore the cameras.
Yeah, for sure. That's amazing. Let's talk before we finish up here. You mentioned working for Dallas Cowboys, and how did you get into getting that job, and what do you do? What does your job entail, I guess, working for the Cowboys?
Well, currently I've been with the Cowboys for about 16 years.
Wow.
And at AT&T Stadium.
Yeah.
And, we have this humongous video screen that hangs in the middle of everything, and I'm responsible for it and making sure that everything works here in order to put pictures on that.
Yeah.
As well as game coverage and that sort of thing. But the whole time that I was working for Color Dynamics and doing other things like that, I kept my fingers in the freelance market and made multiple contacts because, it pays to be versatile.
Oh, sure.
Diversified in this industry, and in many industries it does. And I have had an association with the Cowboys since 1990 from an engineering standpoint. And they asked me to come on board when they built this stadium. And I thought, how often do you get to do something like that?
Yeah.
So I came on at that point, and I've been with them ever since.
Wow. That's awesome. I love that. And I love hearing your journey and hearing, kind of how you got started in the entertainment business, where you are now. To me, it's always fascinating to hear the journey that people have to go down to get to where they are, and the experiences they've had along the way is always inspiring to me. If there's people who's listening to the podcast or watching the podcast who wants to get into directing or video engineering or any of those kind of things, what advice would you give someone who wants to jump into the industry, which is a very different industry today and getting into it than it was back when you started? But is there any advice that you could share for people who might be interested in something like that?
I give tours to technical groups of kids, mainly from high schools here quite often, and we talk about that. And I always tell them this: you may think you want to be a director, or you may think you want to be a cameraman or an actor, but it's important that you sample everything, because it's just as important to figure out what you don't want to do as it is to figure out what you do want to do.
For sure.
So don't turn anything down. Try it all. Yeah. If they hand you a mop and say, here, clean this studio, clean that studio. You never know when they may say, hey, the cameraman didn't show up today. You want to stand behind this camera for a while. Yeah. Don't be afraid to experiment. Don't ever think that you'll never get the opportunity, because you'll get the opportunity if you're there when the opportunity presents itself.
Absolutely. I love that. I have, I tell the kids on my show the same thing. We give them opportunities to work behind the scenes and things when we're not currently filming something, if they want to look at, how the cameras operate or things like that. And I think that's an important thing, important information to share to people. Because I think a lot of times, like for me, myself, I grew up going, I wanted to do this one thing. And then I graduated high school, and then it was like, okay, actually, I don't want to do this. So now what do I want to do? Right. But I think, especially as kids, if they're given the opportunities to do things, like that's what I think was so remarkable with Barney is you had young kids on television or on these videos having the opportunity to live out the idea of what it means to be an actor or actress or any of those things, that I think if they're provided those opportunities, they can, one, either learn, I really enjoy this, let me lean into it more, or I actually don't like this as much as I thought, but I think I like to do this instead. And they get the opportunity to just follow those dreams and try those hats on, which then you end up with someone like yourself who's so versatile in many different things that's just more opportunities you get to take if they present themselves.
Right. Nothing's boring. I mean, in my work, in years of doing what I do, I've worked on industrial videos. I've worked on, entertainment, sports. But even the least job you do, you can find excitement in. Yeah. If you're going to go to the potato chip factory and shoot the machinery for an industrial video, isn't it interesting how potato chips are made? Right. You can gain your own interest that way. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Thank you so much, Dwin, for doing this for us again. Like I said in the very beginning, it's definitely an honor for me. As a child, there was never a moment where I thought I would sit across from anyone who worked on this show that was the soundtrack to my life and be able to share a conversation with them. So anytime I'm able to do that, it's always an honor. So thank you again for agreeing to spend some time with me this morning. My pleasure. And remember to use your imagination. That goes for adults as well as children. Absolutely. I love that. The last question I have for you, the way that we end it, is I always just ask, for you yourself, why Barney? And that could be however you interpret that question. Why is the character important? Why did you work on this show? It could be however you interpret it, but just why Barney for you? Well, for me, as I look back on my career, and I plan to retire in a couple of years, Barney is a very pleasant thought, and to think that he's left a lasting impact the way he has, especially on young minds, is very fulfilling. Yeah. Awesome. I love that. Well, thank you again, Dwin, so much for doing this for us. Barney history fans, I hope you all enjoyed this episode of the podcast. And who knows, maybe next time we'll see you in your spot of love. Take care, everybody.